The CEO sat in his office, a quiet, spacious room with large windows that overlooked the bustling city below. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. The company was thriving, its employees well-trained and its reputation stellar. However, behind the polished facade, things weren't as smooth as they appeared. For months now, whispers had circulated within the company. Rumors of unfair treatment, discrimination, and troubling behavior from one of the managers had begun to surface. It wasn't anything outright that could be proved in a court of law, but the rumors were loud enough to catch the CEO's attention. He had heard the reports, of course, employees speaking up, complaining about how one manager was consistently acting with a bias that was hard to ignore, but no one wanted to speak out too loudly. The fear of losing their job or being ostracized in the office was a powerful deterrent. Some would nod along quietly, expressing their frustrations behind closed doors, but none had the courage to come forward and expose the problem. For the CEO, this wasn't just an issue of management. It was a matter of trust. How could his employees be expected to give their best if they didn't feel safe, respected, and supported? The company prided itself on its diversity and inclusivity policies, but these reports made him question if they were truly being enforced at every level. The CEO had always been an open and approachable figure. He didn't like the idea of corporate suits or distant management, preferring instead to engage with his employees directly. But as the company had grown, it became harder and harder to truly understand what was happening on the ground. He was no longer in the trenches with them, working side by side with his employees. Instead, he sat in his office making big decisions, while his staff did their jobs out of sight. This disconnect troubled him. He could no longer take the pulse of his company just by walking through the halls. His day-to-day was filled with board meetings, strategy sessions, and business travel. There had to be a way to really see what was going on. He knew what needed to be done. The CEO decided to go undercover. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. He had been running this company for years, and his name was well known in the industry. His face was recognized in most business circles. To go undercover meant stepping away from his identity, becoming just another face in the crowd. But if he was ever going to truly understand what was happening within his company, this was the only way. The plan was simple. He would disguise himself as an ordinary employee, working alongside his staff. He'd take on a low-level position in one of the departments where the rumors had been the loudest. The idea was to observe, listen, and see things firsthand. He would remain hidden in plain sight, gaining access to a side of the company that most CEOs never saw. For the first time in years, he would get to see what it was really like to work at his company. He spent a few days preparing for his new role. He needed to make sure everything looked authentic. No fancy suits, no high-end accessories. He would wear the same uniform as everyone else, keep a low profile, and blend in. In the days leading up to the undercover operation, he spent hours in front of the mirror trying to transform himself. It was harder than he had imagined. The sleek business attire he usually wore had been replaced by a simple shirt and khaki pants. His once neatly trimmed hair was styled casually, and he even went so far as to change his hairstyle a bit just to make sure no one would recognize him immediately. He told no one of his plans, not even his closest colleagues. It had to remain a secret. The CEO knew the risks involved in this kind of operation. If anyone found out who he truly was, it could cause a scandal, but he felt he had no other choice. He needed to understand what was happening on the ground, away from the polished reports and the smooth presentations that came with every executive meeting. He made his first appearance at the company's headquarters early in the morning, walking through the front doors with nothing more than a simple badge and a name tag. He was now just another face in the crowd. At first, it felt strange. He had spent years walking these halls as a leader, holding meetings and offering advice. But now he was just another worker, standing at the photocopier with the rest of the staff, quietly observing everything that was happening around him. It didn't take long for him to notice the atmosphere in the office. Despite the company's best efforts to foster an inclusive environment, there was an underlying tension that seemed to hang in the air. People walked with their heads down, speaking quietly to each other, their faces devoid of the usual enthusiasm that the CEO had expected. As he spent more time in the office, he began to understand why. There were whispers, quiet conversations between employees who looked over their shoulders before speaking. The CEO, trying to remain inconspicuous, overheard the conversations about the manager, how he favored certain employees over others, how he would make snide comments under his breath, and how he seemed to treat some workers with far less respect than others. But one particular conversation caught his attention. Two employees were talking at the coffee machine, speaking in hushed tones. The CEO could barely hear them, but he caught a few words. Always targets him, won't even let him speak in meetings, followed by a quick glance around the room. The names were not mentioned, but the description was enough to make the CEO wonder if the rumors were about the manager he had been hearing about. The more he observed, the more it became clear that something was wrong. There was a pattern to the behavior, and it was no coincidence. The manager was systematically isolating certain employees. Most of them were people of color, and the CEO could see it now. He was targeting individuals, belittling them, making them feel inferior. This wasn't just about an ineffective manager. It was something deeper, something more troubling. The CEO felt a growing sense of discomfort. He had seen subtle discrimination before in other places, but this was something more direct, more intentional. He was witnessing it firsthand, but what could he do about it? He couldn't rush in, guns blazing. He needed to gather more evidence to make sure he understood the full picture. After all, he was here to observe, not to make an immediate change. As the day went on, the CEO's sense of disbelief grew. Could this really be happening under his watch? He had always prided himself on the culture of his company, its commitment to inclusivity and equality. But here he was, witnessing something completely different. This wasn't just about a bad manager. It was a sign that there were cracks in the system, cracks that went unnoticed by upper management. If he didn't act quickly, things could get worse. The CEO realized that his decision to go undercover might be the only way to fix this, but first he needed to gather more information. He needed to see everything, every conversation, every interaction, and that meant staying undercover just a little longer. As the days passed, the CEO continued to blend in. He kept his head down, worked quietly, and maintained a low profile. He had a desk near the back of the office, a place where few people passed by, ensuring he could observe the goings-on without drawing too much attention to himself. It was a strange feeling, being in the midst of his employees without any of them knowing who he really was. But the more he observed, the more unsettling things became. The rumors about the manager's behavior weren't exaggerated. They were true, and worse than he had imagined. The CEO began to notice the pattern more clearly now, especially with one particular employee. This worker, a black man who had been with the company for several years, seemed to bear the brunt of the manager's cruel treatment. The employee's name was never mentioned openly, but it wasn't hard for the CEO to piece things together. Every time the manager entered the room, the mood shifted. The tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one dared to speak up. It was like watching a predator stalk its prey, and the CEO could do nothing but watch. The manager's tactics were subtle at first, small insults here and there under his breath or in ways that could be brushed off as a misunderstanding. But as the CEO paid closer attention, it became clear that these comments were far from accidental. They were deliberate and calculated, designed to make the employee feel small and insignificant. One day during a meeting, the CEO witnessed the manager's behavior firsthand. The employee, who had been performing admirably, was asked to give a short update on a project he had been working on. As soon as he started speaking, the manager interrupted him, dismissing his points without consideration. The employee, trying to remain calm, continued, but the manager cut him off again, this time ridiculing his ideas in front of everyone. The CEO watched in disbelief. He could see the discomfort in the employee's eyes, the way he tried to keep his composure, but it was clear he was being humiliated. The rest of the room sat in awkward silence, clearly uncomfortable with the exchange, but no one spoke up. No one dared to challenge the manager. The CEO could feel his anger building. He had always valued respect in the workplace, and what he was witnessing was the exact opposite of that. It wasn't just about one manager or one employee. It was about a toxic atmosphere that was spreading throughout the entire team. If this behavior wasn't addressed, it would only continue to fester and grow. As the meeting continued, the CEO couldn't shake the image of the employee's face. It was a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and resignation. He was used to this treatment, and the CEO could see that. It was as though he had been conditioned to accept it, to expect nothing more than this kind of treatment from his superiors. After the meeting, the CEO took the opportunity to talk to the employee. He approached him casually, as if they were just two colleagues having a chat. The employee looked up from his desk, surprised but not entirely unwelcoming. The CEO struck up a conversation, asking about his work, his role, and how things were going. At first, the employee was cautious, unsure if he could trust this new person. But as the conversation continued, the CEO could sense the walls slowly coming down. The employee spoke of his work with pride, his dedication to the company, and how he had consistently put in extra hours to ensure things ran smoothly. But when the CEO gently asked him about the manager, the employee's face tightened. "It's nothing," the employee said, quickly looking away. "Just how things are." The CEO pressed gently, not wanting to force him, but the employee finally relented. "The manager, he's been on my case for months now. Every time I get a project, he'll either ignore it or criticize it without reason. He's never satisfied. If I ask a question, he makes it seem like I'm not smart enough to understand." The CEO could hear the frustration in his voice. "And no one says anything?" The employee shook his head. "What can I do? He's the boss. He can do whatever he wants. I just try to keep my head down and do my job. I don't want to make things worse." The CEO felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't imagine what it must be like for the employee, knowing that speaking out would only make things more difficult for him. He had been bullied, silenced, and made to feel insignificant for far too long. The CEO knew he had to do something, but what could he do in this moment? He was just another employee, no different from the others, at least for now. As the conversation ended, the CEO promised to stay in touch and assured the employee that he wasn't alone. He could sense the relief in the employee's posture, a slight softening of the shoulders as if the weight of the world had been lifted for just a moment. But the CEO knew the reality. That weight would return the moment the employee had to face the manager again. And that reality was something the CEO could no longer ignore. The next few days were a blur. The CEO watched the manager continue his behavior, singling out the employee in front of others, making him feel like an outsider. He would criticize his work openly, belittle his efforts in front of the team, and then turn his attention to other employees as if nothing had happened. It was a cycle, a constant stream of small humiliations designed to break the employee's spirit. The CEO couldn't let this go on any longer. But what could he do without exposing his true identity? He couldn't confront the manager directly, not yet. His plan was still in motion, and he needed to gather more evidence to ensure that his claims would hold weight. The last thing he wanted was for the manager to slip through the cracks, to continue hurting his employees without any consequences. In the meantime, the CEO began to notice other signs of tension in the office. He observed how the manager would often play favorites, offering certain employees more perks, better opportunities, and greater recognition, while others, especially people of color, were left to fend for themselves. It wasn't just the black employee who was being treated unfairly. There were others too, although not as openly targeted as the employee he had been focusing on. The CEO began to feel the weight of the situation. His company, the one he had worked so hard to build, was not as inclusive as he had hoped. There were deep-rooted issues that needed to be addressed, and it wasn't going to be easy. But he couldn't just stand by and watch as his employees suffered. The longer he stayed undercover, the more determined he became. He couldn't allow this toxic culture to continue. He had to expose the truth, but first, he needed to gather enough information. He needed to speak to more employees, get their stories, and build a case strong enough to confront the manager and anyone else who was contributing to the problem. But for now, he was just a worker. He was still blending in, still hiding behind the mask of a regular employee, and the longer he stayed in that role, the more he realized just how deep the problem went. The days that followed were a blur of observations and growing realizations. The CEO had seen enough to understand that the problem wasn't just isolated to the manager's treatment of one employee. The deeper he dug, the more he realized how widespread the issue was. The toxic atmosphere in the company wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a system of favoritism, prejudice, and discrimination that had taken root within the organization. The more time he spent in the office, the more he noticed the subtle ways the manager undermined not only the black employee, but also others who seemed to be overlooked or sidelined. It wasn't just about making rude comments or embarrassing people in front of their colleagues. It was about making certain employees feel like they didn't belong, that their contributions weren't valued. It was a constant, relentless attack on their confidence, their morale, and their sense of worth. The CEO knew he had to get to the heart of the issue, so he began spending more time with the black employee. Let's call him Brian. Every time the CEO would approach him, there was an unmistakable weariness in his eyes, like he had grown used to the constant humiliation. It wasn't just one incident. It was months, maybe even years of this kind of treatment wearing him down little by little. At first, Brian had been hesitant to speak. He was cautious, keeping his guard up in case this was just another corporate move, another attempt to pacify him without actually changing anything. But as the CEO continued to engage with him, Brian started to open up, and what he shared was even more disturbing than the CEO could have imagined. Brian explained that this wasn't just about a manager with a bad attitude. No, this ran deeper. It was about a culture of silence, a company that had ignored the warning signs for too long. The thing is, Brian started, choosing his words carefully, most of the time, we just deal with it. We show up, do our jobs, and go home. We don't ask for much, but we don't get much either. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of sadness that the CEO couldn't ignore. Are you saying that no one's ever said anything to HR? The CEO asked, trying to get a clearer picture of the situation. Brian paused for a moment, looking around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. He leaned in slightly. It's not like we don't try, but when we do, it's like nothing changes. The complaints go into a black hole and nothing ever gets addressed. The manager's still here doing whatever he wants. It feels like we're invisible. The CEO's heart sank. He had suspected there was a problem, but hearing Brian's words made it all the more real. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a culture where those in power could act with impunity and those without power had no choice but to accept it. The CEO was ashamed of what he was hearing. His company, the one he had built, the one he had worked so hard to create, was no better than the toxic environments he had vowed to avoid. The more Brian spoke, the more the CEO realized just how deep the problem went. It wasn't just about one manager or one department. It was about a company-wide issue that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The CEO could see that Brian wasn't the only one who had suffered. There were others, other employees who had been overlooked, underpaid, and made to feel like they didn't matter. As the conversation went on, the CEO learned more about the daily struggles his employees faced. He heard about the subtle biases that crept into the hiring process, the way promotions were given to those who were more connected, not necessarily more qualified. He heard about the employees who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, only to be passed over for opportunities, while others who were less deserving were given everything. But perhaps the most painful part of the conversation was hearing about the employees who had tried to leave. Some had moved on to other companies, seeking a better work environment, but many hadn't left at all. They had simply grown silent, resigned to their fate. They didn't fight back. They didn't stand up. They just kept going through the motions, doing their jobs while feeling invisible, unwanted, and unimportant. The CEO had always prided himself on the company's culture. He had always believed that everyone deserved respect, regardless of their background or position. But now, as he sat across from Brian, he realized that respect had been a hollow promise, something they said in their mission statement but hadn't followed through on. I never thought I'd be here, talking to someone like you about all this, Brian said, his voice quieter now. But I can't keep pretending everything's okay. It's not just about the manager. It's about how no one's doing anything to change things. It's like they want us to just shut up and deal with it. The CEO nodded, absorbing everything Brian had said. It was clear now that this wasn't just about fixing a single problem. It was about dismantling an entire system that had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. It was about creating an environment where everyone had a voice, where people felt seen and heard, no matter their position or their background. But the CEO knew it wouldn't be easy. The changes that needed to be made would require more than just firing a few bad apples. They would require a complete overhaul of the way the company operated, from the top down. It wasn't just about addressing the issues in one department or with one manager. It was about changing the very culture of the company, and that was going to take time. Don't worry, Brian. the CEO said, his voice steady and determined. I'm going to make sure things change. You're not invisible. None of you are. Brian looked up at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. But it was clear that years of being treated like he didn't matter had taken their toll. Hope wasn't something he trusted easily anymore. The CEO knew that regaining that trust, earning back the respect of his employees, was going to take time. But he had to start somewhere. And the only way to truly fix this was to confront the issue head-on. He spent the next few days talking to more employees, gathering stories, and understanding the full scope of the problem. Everywhere he went, he heard the same thing. Employees who felt like they didn't belong, like their contributions didn't matter. It was clear that this wasn't just one bad manager. It was an entire culture that had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. The CEO's frustration grew as he realized how many people had been hurt by this system. But he also knew that he couldn't fix everything overnight. The changes would be hard, and they would require a shift in mindset at every level of the company. But one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He couldn't continue to sit back and let his employees suffer in silence. The time for action had come, and the CEO was determined to take it no matter the cost. The CEO's heart raced as he sat in his car, staring out at the bustling city around him. The day had come. The time for observing was over. He couldn't stand idly by anymore while his employees suffered under the oppressive hand of the manager. What he had witnessed over the past few weeks, every insult, every dismissal, every cruel comment, had built up to this moment. It was time to confront the problem head-on. The manager had no idea what was coming. As far as he knew, the CEO was just another low-level employee, someone who had been blending into the background like the rest. But that was all about to change. The CEO had gathered enough evidence, spoken to enough employees, and watched the manager's behavior long enough to know that he had to take action. He walked into the building, a sense of determination in his step. The usual office chatter filled the air as he made his way to the manager's office. The manager was just finishing up a meeting with a few employees, and the CEO knew this was his chance. He had to catch him alone. When the door to the manager's office finally opened, the CEO stepped inside, his heart pounding. The manager looked up in surprise. Well, look who we have here, the manager said with a sneer, clearly not recognizing the CEO. You must be the new guy. What can I do for you? The CEO didn't respond right away. He stood there, studying the man who had been the source of so much pain for his employees. The manager seemed arrogant, overly confident, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. I'm not here to waste time with pleasantries, the CEO said, his voice calm but firm. I'm here to talk about your behavior. The manager's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, a look of disdain creeping onto his face. My behavior? I don't know what you're talking about. The CEO stepped closer, his eyes locking onto the manager's. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I've been watching you, and I've seen the way you treat your employees, particularly one of them. Your actions, your words are unacceptable. The manager blinked in confusion, his face reddening as the CEO continued. You've been humiliating, belittling, and disrespecting your staff for far too long. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I've heard it from them too. The way you target certain employees, especially those from minority backgrounds, needs to stop. The manager laughed, though it was a hollow sound, almost nervous. You're just some low-level worker. What do you know about me or how I manage? The CEO took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. This wasn't the time to get emotional. He needed to stay focused. I know everything I need to know. I've seen how you speak to your staff, how you make them feel small, unimportant. I've seen the way you talk down to people, ignore their contributions, and act like they don't matter. That behavior ends today. The manager's face darkened, and for a brief moment the CEO thought he might snap, but instead the manager sneered. You think you can come in here and change everything? You don't know how things work around here. I've been doing this job for years, and I'm not about to take orders from some random employee. The CEO's expression remained steady. You're right. I'm not just any random employee. I'm the CEO of this company. The manager froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The CEO watched him closely, allowing the realization to sink in. The manager's arrogance was now replaced by panic. his confidence crumbling as the truth hit him. You're the CEO? The manager stammered. But I didn't. The CEO cut him off. No, you didn't, because I've been working undercover for the past few weeks. I've been watching you. I've seen everything. And what I've seen isn't just bad management. It's harassment. It's discrimination. It's bullying. And it's not going to be tolerated any longer. The manager tried to recover, but his words stumbled over each other. I didn't mean... I didn't think. I didn't know. The CEO wasn't having it. You didn't think? That's the problem. You didn't think about the people you were hurting. You didn't think about the employees who came here to work hard and make a living, not to be torn down by someone like you. You didn't think about the damage you were doing to the culture of this company, and now you're going to have to face the consequences. For a moment, the manager said nothing. He just sat there stunned, as if the weight of the situation had finally hit him. But the CEO wasn't done. I've spoken to your employees, the CEO continued. I've heard their stories. I've heard about the way you've made them feel worthless, how you've humiliated them in front of their peers. I've heard about the subtle ways you've sabotaged their careers just because of who they are. And it's all coming to an end. The manager tried to speak, but the CEO raised his hand, silencing him. Don't bother. I've already made my decision. You're fired, effective immediately. You've violated the company's core values. You've created a toxic environment, and I can't allow that to continue. You're no longer part of this company. The manager's face twisted with anger. You can't do this. You have no idea what you're doing. You'll regret this. But the CEO stood firm. I'm doing what's right. You're not the first person to think they're untouchable, but I'm not like the others. I don't care how long you've been here or how much power you think you have. You're not above the law, and you're certainly not above the values that this company stands for. The manager stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was red with fury, his fists clenched at his sides. But he didn't make a move. He knew he had lost. The CEO had made it clear that there was no turning back. I've already made arrangements with HR, the CEO said, his voice calm but unyielding. They'll handle the rest. You're not welcome here anymore. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was thick, and the manager seemed to shrink in on himself, realizing the depth of his mistake. Finally, the CEO turned to leave, but before he did, he looked back at the manager. I don't enjoy this. I don't take pleasure in firing people. But when you treat others like they don't matter, when you destroy their confidence and their trust, you lose the right to be part of this company. With that, the CEO walked out of the office, his head held high. He had done what was necessary, but it wasn't over yet. The manager may have been gone, but the work to fix the company had just begun. As the CEO made his way down the hallway, he felt a strange sense of relief. The hardest part was over. But now, he had to focus on rebuilding the trust that had been broken. He had to show his employees that things were going to be different, that their voices would be heard and their contributions valued. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in weeks, the CEO felt hopeful. He had taken the first step toward change. The CEO sat quietly in his office, the door to his window slightly cracked, allowing the light to filter in. It had been a few weeks since he had fired the manager. The dust was starting to settle, but the work was far from over. Now it was time to rebuild, time to restore trust, to heal the wounds that had been inflicted, and to make sure that this never happened again. The company had already taken steps toward change. The first was the firing of the manager, but that was just the beginning. The CEO knew he couldn't rely on one act of discipline to fix the culture. It would take a complete shift in the way the company operated, a new mindset that put people first. He had seen the toxic side of the organization, and now it was time to turn it around. The first thing he did was call a company-wide meeting. He needed to address the staff, to let them know that the days of tolerating unfair treatment were over. He stood in front of the room, facing a sea of employees who were eager to hear what he had to say. Some were curious, others skeptical, but all were waiting for something to change. Thank you for coming, the CEO began, his voice calm but firm. I know that there's been a lot of uncertainty lately. Some of you have been hurt, some of you have been overlooked, and some of you have been made to feel like you don't belong here. That's not okay. And I want you to know that I see it. I hear you. There was a quiet murmur in the room as the employees looked around at each other. The CEO could see the wariness in their eyes. They had been let down by the system before, and it would take time to rebuild their faith. But he was determined to show them that things were going to be different. "I've been in your shoes," he continued. "I've seen how easy it is for people to get lost in the system, for the ones who speak out to be ignored, for the ones who do the work to be overlooked. That ends today. We are making a commitment to change." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "This company will be a place where everyone feels valued, where everyone has a voice, where everyone is treated with respect, regardless of their background, their role, or their position. We will hold each other accountable, not just for our work, but for how we treat each other." The room was silent, the employees unsure of how to react. But the CEO could see the change starting to take place in their expressions. Some were nodding slowly, others were looking around as if processing what they were hearing. The change he had promised was no longer just a distant hope. It was becoming a reality. "I know this won't be easy," he continued. "There are deep-seated issues that we need to address, and it will take time. But I'm asking each and every one of you to join me in this. We are all in this together. We are a team, and it's time we start acting like one." He could feel the weight of the room shift, the air thick with anticipation. The employees had heard the CEO's words, but now it was time for action. They needed to see that he was committed to change, not just in words, but in deeds. "I know that some of you have been hurt by what has happened here," the CEO said, his voice softer now. "And I want you to know that I am deeply sorry. We are going to do everything we can to make it right. We are starting with a comprehensive review of our management practices. We are going to introduce new policies, new training, and a clear path for accountability. No one will be allowed to treat another person unfairly. Not on my watch." The room was quiet for a moment longer, the CEO letting the gravity of his words settle in. Then slowly, hands began to rise. Employees were asking questions, speaking up, voicing their concerns. It was the first time in a long while that the room felt alive, that the staff felt like they were a part of something. The CEO took his time, answering each question thoughtfully. He didn't shy away from the tough topics, acknowledging the mistakes that had been made and promising to do better. It was raw, it was real, and it was what the company needed. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. But the CEO had started something important, a conversation. And conversations lead to change. In the weeks that followed, the CEO put his words into action. He worked with HR to overhaul the company's policies. New diversity and inclusion training programs were rolled out. There were new protocols in place for addressing complaints, and the CEO made it clear that there would be zero tolerance for discrimination, whether subtle or overt. But the CEO knew that policies and training weren't enough on their own. They needed to be reinforced with real, tangible changes, and that meant creating a culture of accountability. He made sure that everyone, from top executives to entry-level employees, understood that they were responsible for maintaining a respectful, inclusive workplace. He implemented regular check-ins where employees could provide feedback, express concerns, and share their experiences. These meetings were held in an open, judgment-free environment where everyone felt comfortable speaking their truth. The CEO himself took part in these sessions, ensuring that no one's voice went unheard. It wasn't just about changing the rules. It was about changing the mindset. The CEO made it clear that this was a long-term commitment, a journey that would take time. But he was in it for the long haul, and he wasn't going to stop until the company had become what it was always meant to be, a place where everyone could thrive. And slowly, the culture began to shift. Employees began to speak up more. They began to trust that their concerns would be taken seriously. The manager who had once made them feel small was gone, and in his place was a renewed sense of hope. People felt empowered again, and that empowerment was contagious. The company's performance improved as well. As the atmosphere became more inclusive, productivity soared. Employees were happier, more engaged, and more willing to collaborate. The work environment had changed, and the results spoke for themselves. It wasn't all perfect. There were bumps along the way, moments where things didn't go as planned, but the CEO stayed the course, always remembering why he had started this journey in the first place. It was never about making a quick fix. It was about creating a company where respect and equality weren't just ideals, but the foundation of everything they did. In the end, the CEO was proud of what they had accomplished. The company was no longer just a business. It had become a community, a place where people felt seen, heard, and valued. It had taken time, but the changes were real and the employees could feel it. And as for Brian, the employee who had been treated so unfairly, he was given a new role in the company. A leadership position that recognized his hard work and dedication. The CEO knew that Brian's journey was just one example of how far they had come, but it was also a reminder of how much further they still had to go. The CEO smiled to himself as he thought about the future. It was bright. The road ahead was long, but they were on the right path now. The company was finally living up to its promise. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.